Hello and welcome to the October 2020 installment of the Aga Khan Museum Global Conversation Series. In this new series, we bring together arts and culture leaders from across the world to dive into the big issues facing museums today. I'm Marika Sardar, curator at the Aga Khan Museum, and today I'm joined by two panelists working in the field of museum accessibility. The first is Poulomi joining us from India, and the second is Goabaone Montsho joining us from Botswana. As I'm a newcomer to this area, I will simply be here facilitating a conversation between the two of them as an opportunity for all of us to learn from their expertise and perspectives. So first, to start off, I'd like you both to introduce yourselves. May I start with you, Poulomi?
Thank you, Marika. Thank you, Aga Khan Museum. Hi, I'm Pauline Desai. I've been working as a consultant for museums and heritage spaces for about 2 decades in India. I am also a blog writer since the last 5 years. I take people on guided tours in heritage sites of India. I'm also a visiting faculty at some design and heritage management universities in India. And very recently, along with a young design team, I have started something called the Museum Memories Project, which aims at collecting memories of people from across the world of any museum or heritage site that they have visited in their lifetime. And it's a project that aims to make museums and heritage sites more accessible and inclusive so that, sitting in your house, especially during the lockdown, you can't go anywhere, but you can actually log into that project and look at what other people are doing, what they have seen. It's a kind of a platform to make these museums more accessible and reach a larger group of people.
Yes, you've been really active during this lockdown period, which is, one of the reasons why I wanted to connect with you. The presence of this project online has really been impressive. And that was one of the reasons why I got in touch with Montsho as well, who's quite active writing for museum blogs and so on, also in this sphere. But please, will you introduce yourself, Montsho?
Thank you, Marika. My name is Goabaone. I am an ethnology curator here at Botswana National Museum. Botswana is a country in Southern Africa. My first degree is a BA in anthropology from Vancouver Island University. My second degree is in public policy and administration from University of Botswana. My job entails curating thematic ethnographic exhibitions, working with researchers and students. I also do a bit of research and publish on various trending museological related issues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both so much for being with us today. Now, both of you come to the issue of museum accessibility from different backgrounds and advocate for groups with different types of needs. So would you be able to tell us a bit about your own professional or personal history and what motivated you to move into this area? Are there groups that you speak for particularly? And of all the things going on in the world right now, why do you think access to museums in particular right now is so important? Please, Montsho, will you start us off?
Thank you. First and foremost, let me state that I am a totally blind ethnology curator. I have been blind for the past 15 years of my life. So as a person living with a disability, I do understand the frustration and the pain caused by social exclusion or the lack of accessibility when it comes to accessing public goods and public services, particularly for people living with disabilities. For example, a good number of blind people believe that museums are places for seeing. So museums are not places for the blind, just as music concerts are not places for the deaf. So the desire to change the status quo, to question, to challenge the status quo, is what has motivated me to advocate for accessibility. Secondly, with a background in public policy, it is my understanding that a wide range of the world's marginalized, the world's most vulnerable people or groups, ranging from people with disabilities, indigenous people, ethnic minorities, LGBT communities, are plagued with social justice issues, ranging from poverty, unemployment, income disparities, etc., etc. And the underlying factor behind these social problems is lack of accessibility to opportunities. So, as a curator, I believe that I have a social responsibility to contribute to the social development of the marginalized members of our societies. I believe that museum access is particularly important for people living with disabilities because museums are key cultural institutions. So people living with disabilities have the right, it's actually their human right to participate in the cultural lives of their societies. So if museums are not accessible to those people, it means they will be automatically excluded from participating in the cultural lives of their societies. Thank you.
Thank you for putting that so eloquently and so forcefully. I really feel so moved myself as a curator to think of, the power that we have with our collections, and I strive to do more and to do better in the future. Poulomi, what about you? What drew you to this area?
So I agree with Montsho that we don't understand when we are designing museums or even making policies at the government level that we have to be part of the community. We sometimes focus on a certain kind of visitor, a kind of an ideal visitor who can read or write, especially English, and in a country like India, that doesn't actually work, right? In a country with multiple languages and multicultural background, and large section of the population are non-literate. So whenever I visit a museum as a visitor, not just as somebody who's working behind the scenes, I always look for something that would trigger me to look at that artifact or that object, look more closely. And I found that missing. So when I've been working for museums, one thing, I worked in a museum also in Mumbai, I have always tried to, find out in terms of my research and content writing, something about the objects that are on display that would appeal to somebody else beyond this perfect ideal visitor. Something quirky, an anecdote, or maybe the tone in which the information is written. So museums all across the world cater to the 11, 12-year-olds because that's the peak in the learning curve. But what about the others? And my focus area has been young adults, the 18 to 24 age group. And it's alarming how this age group is deeply affected by depression. There's a large number of people who have no access to mental health, medication, or even if they are considered a big burden and a stigma on society. So how do we figure out to reach these people? I wouldn't even say groups because they're not even part of groups here. At least I can say that for India. It's not, many people have support groups that they can reach out to. So simple as that, when I'm feeling low, I would love to, have a Van Gogh or a Rembrandt or a, Mughal painting or a beautiful dance from anywhere in the world to distract me or make me feel happy. I might not think of a museum then. So what do we think of in today's world? We just think of the phone. That's the best way to connect. So instead of figuring out these, highly structured, um, in a country like India, extremely colonial, um, extremely elitist in most places, these museums have become just like ivory towers. And somebody commented recently that museums in India are all about royal families and the glamour and glory. What about people like us? Nobody thinks about us. So it's not easy, because I mean your funding agencies, your sponsors do not think of that larger population, but that population actually constitutes a big segment of India's visitors. And in India, another problem we have in the museum sector is that we don't have adequate visitor statistics. So museums are actually being made for who then, who is the visitor. So that's something that triggered me, that if I am in a position of making any change or bringing about anything that's constructive and creative and positive, so let me do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that perspective as well. I have a lot to learn from both of you in terms of vocabulary and also just broadening my own perspective. I'm afraid I do fall into that category of thinking of, a particular type of visitor to the gallery. And so I really appreciate learning from you both. So with the typical state of museums today, there must be many conditions that immediately make access difficult for the people you are trying to support. So while I feel there's a general awareness perhaps of things like wheelchair access, making things physically accessible in Canada, I think there must be so many other aspects of museum design and the presentation of our objects or the information we have about them that make our spaces and collections inaccessible on many other levels. And I think you've both started to touch on this a bit. In your experience, are there things that museums do inadvertently that cut off access to different audiences? How do we change our mindset from the get-go, from the design and early phases to make our galleries accessible to as many people as possible? And in answering this, is there a project that you've been involved in that might address these kinds of needs and that you'd like to talk about? Again, Montsho, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you. First, generally speaking, museums have a tradition of focusing on the sense of sight when it comes to presenting their collections to the public. This automatically cuts off museum audiences who would prefer to interact with collections through other senses, like hearing, smell, and touch. I think museums should adopt a holistic approach that encompasses all other senses when it comes to presenting their exhibitions and their collections to the public. Secondly, generally speaking, museums have a practice of adopting accessibility features as an afterthought in their exhibitions. In some cases, you will realize that accessible exhibitions are temporary. So I believe that museums should adopt the principles of universal design so that their exhibitions and collections are accessible permanently to most groups of society. Finally, I would say, generally speaking, some museum websites are difficult to navigate, particularly using screen readers. So that automatically cuts off museum audiences online visitors who are visually impaired. So museums have a responsibility there to make sure that their websites and visual exhibition and online material is accessible most groups of society. I am currently I'm curating an exhibition actually. It's titled Botswana's Traditional Attire and Ornaments Exhibition. It'll be a virtual exhibition. So the accessibility component that I'm working on at the moment is to produce audio narratives that are descriptive enough for visually impaired online visitors and people with learning disabilities to be able to interact and interpret the visual exhibits on their own. Thank you.
Well, the two of us, we were nodding in agreement with a lot of what you said, particularly about accessibility being sort of an afterthought or applied just to the temporary exhibitions, sort of as and when certain projects, strike us to add these features. So, and I'm also showing on the screen now images you had sent of this exhibition that you're putting together now. And which looks to be a very exciting one, by the way. But it's also a good point you make about websites, because I think a lot of us would like to think by putting our collections and information about our museums online that we are really doing a service and reaching out to audiences. But as you say, even with that, there are things we should be aware of on the websites themselves and how they're designed.
Mm-hmm.
And as for you, Poulomi, as you've already alluded to a few of the projects that you've been working on, would you like to speak to those?
I would first like to mention that museums in India do not have their collections available online. So that is the starting point, I mean, I couldn't agree more with both of you. So I have a website. I do write a blog in which, if you can see it on the top, I've just tried to put some excerpts from some of the blogs I write, where I write for 18-24-year-olds because I teach them also. So these are sometimes topics that I've taught in class, but these are all related to art, design, architecture, heritage, museums, collections, some monument that one has visited, maybe with them, trying to dig deeper and find out many more aspects and many more perspectives to it. And because that's in my control. So I do the blog for free. There's no monetary or financial transaction involved. So it's not that people are paying me to write it. So I'm going to write only for that particular group. And the other thing, as I mentioned, is the Museum Memories project, in which we are in the process of putting up a website. Actually, the website is going to be up on the 10th of October. And it will not only have the personal memories that people have sent us, there's going to be a glossary of some terms, like conservation, like curation, like what is a collection, so that people can understand, those who are new to the sector. Also, there's going to be an interview with expert sections where we are talking to museum and heritage art and design and conservation architects, these professionals who bring in their years of experience and who can elaborate and talk and give a behind the scenes functioning of museums, which we don't always get to hear. Another section is a graphic stories section where historical events, personalities, like something as simple as how the turkey and zebra comes into India during the time of Emperor Jahangir, or the question of Akbar and his learning difficulties, and though he becomes one of the most important emperors in the world, he could not read or write. And the museum movement, how it started, how it comes to India. So these have been, given these historical stories with authentic research by senior historians has been given to young artists and designers, which will be interpreted in their own way in the form of monthly series which comes out every week on the website, and there are many other such plans. So the idea is to not restrict people, but to start a sort of a discussion amongst just anybody and everybody. Yes, we have started only with English at this point, but we want to make it more accessible. We want to reach out to different audiences, so people who are blind, visually impaired, deaf, hearing impaired, they also have some kind of access. I can't ensure full access at this point. I understand there are lots of limitations, and the fact that we have literally no funding for this project as of now, that does not make things easy. But we want it to be a mixture of entertainment and education and highly interactive and immersive kind of an experience. If museums can't do it in India for whatever reasons, why should I sit back and wait for them to do something? Let's involve people. It's a crowdsourced project because the memories come from people, the interviews are from experts. It's not one person who's deciding all this. It's just we are, just facilitators who are putting this all together. So that's the best one could do during the lockdown. And yes, let's see where it takes us. But apart from that, we need to make people in India very much aware of a large section of population who are left out from the entire discussion of not just culture and museums, but anything in society. So I hope that answers your question, Marika.
Yes, it does. And I can see how the features that you're developing would really appeal to a wider audience. And I think giving that background information about how museums work, as well as the more offbeat stories behind the objects, would be appealing and maybe make people more comfortable already just walking in the museum if they've had this kind of information and interaction beforehand. And again, that's something I kind of take for granted, being able to go anywhere and feel at home in museums. That's sort of my natural setting, but I know they can be intimidating to a lot of people who don't perhaps think that they know how to behave or how to understand or what to do, or if it's for them, as you've also mentioned. Would you say that there have been any particular types of responses to this type of work you're doing in the region that you're working? Do you feel supported in these kinds of projects? Are the museums that you've been a part of open to addressing these kinds of issues? For you, Montsho, for this exhibition you're developing right now, could you talk a little bit more about the features you mentioned as in terms of people with who are partially sighted or are blind, and sort of the museum's support of this project?
Okay. Let me start by saying, during my first day at work here at Botswana National Museum, I had a conversation with the museum director, Mr. Stephen Mohotsi, in his office. And he told me that he was very pleased that for the first time, Botswana National Museum has a blind curator. And he immediately introduced me to the mega project of the museum, which is the refurbishment of the permanent exhibition of Botswana National Museum. And he asked me to make suggestions on how the museum should be, on how the exhibition could be made more accessible for people with disabilities. So I did make some recommendations, and then he made sure that the consultants and the contractor are aware of accessibility features well in time, and that they will incorporate them as part of the project. And for the past, we had a temporary exhibition 2 years ago when our museum was 2050, and my chief curator, ethnology chief curator, requested that I should produce braille labels for as an alternative format for the exhibition, something which I did. And so based on those sentiments, I believe that the museum, Botswana National Museum, is open to the concept of accessibility. With the upcoming virtual traditional time ornaments exhibition, I have the leeway, the green light to make it as much accessible as much as possible, as much as I can. And the accessibility features that I've been thinking of is to have audio descriptions, to have an audio guide, and to make sure that the lighting is also appropriate for people with low vision. I understand that we cannot have Braille because it's online, so that will be replaced by audio. Thank you.
Okay, that's really wonderful to hear about the approach of your museum and to hear how well supported you've been, and that sort of between the permanent collection and the temporary exhibitions, you're aiming to be so inclusive. How about you? What's the situation in India, would you say? Is there support for the kind of advocacy you're trying to do?
I wouldn't know if I could use the term advocacy also, because the thing is, it's very new for India when we talk of access and inclusion. And I am not necessarily talking about a visible group. I am not talking about access to people whom we can say that, but just by looking at them that they need access. I'm talking about a group, again, 18 to 24-year-olds who don't visit museums. And that's an issue we have across the world, right?
Yes.
And I'm also talking about, I know it sounds very niche and like a micro segment, is a group of people who probably have some kind of depression, and we don't actually know multiple ways of reaching out to them. Like, should the museum be designed in a manner that people with any kind of, if you're just feeling low in life, you just can walk into this museum and you'll be welcomed? Or do we have special programs that, okay, every, 1 day of the week or 2 days of the week, you can come to us and, we can have these kind of sessions. So there's a new term that's come in some parts of the world called art psychotherapy, and museums are proving to be such places. We are still to figure that out. We are still, because again, we go back to the issue of we don't have visitor statistics. So, and how do you map somebody, from that special kind of a need? So that's a very big challenge. But wherever I teach, or if I contact a museum or a heritage site in India and I tell them I'm coming with this group of students, so I try to embed these museum and heritage site visits in my courses, so that it's a compulsion that, the college agrees to it when we're signing the contract, that yes, I'm teaching this, but also one day I'm going to take them. So I try to make it more multi-perspective, so we go to this museum and then we look for a local cuisine place that we eat. It need not be expensive. It can be something that we eat on the road, but it's local cuisine. Basically it's a way of charging people up, to forcing them to look around, to think more, to invent more, to explore more, so that they try to connect the dots. Because the idea is not to let people feel isolated, that okay, I've seen this fancy, textile, it's a beautiful tent which is up on display, beautifully displayed, the space is air conditioned and everything, but so what? Who am I in part of that whole story? So the idea is to find oneself. So yes, there are places, there are spaces, not just museums, who are welcoming such ideas, but it's not easy, because this is the group that's sort of blind in India. Like we don't accept that they exist. So that's a struggle in itself, right?
Right. So you're starting from a point maybe even that others aren't starting and dealing with this particular issue of even just getting recognition.
Yes.
That issue, yes.
Yes.
So now, one of the reasons I was interested to have this conversation with you is that we're in the very early phases of rethinking our own permanent collection galleries at the Aga Khan Museum. And right now I'm about to put onto the screen some images of what the gallery looks now. And, you know, it's a typical museum space, in this case very modern, lots of white walls, and the objects are very elegantly displayed for sure. But as we rethink our design, you know, as curators, we have been sort of stuck in the content of these objects and how we want to present certain moments in history or developments in our field and so on. But how can we think about our audience to sort of shift the focus to how people will experience this space? And do you have any recommendations either for how we design the galleries or some programming to make these spaces come alive and to make it as accessible as possible? And this time I'll start with you, Poulomi.
So my first suggestion would be that it's such a beautiful, fantastic space. I'm sure your museum team is thinking of it to make it, those 3D views available on your website.
Yes.
And that, so that one can, because when I see this, I immediately think of my students who would not be able to travel there for, not just because of the lockdown, but for other, multiple reasons. And these are students spread across like a rich part of India, like Mumbai or Delhi, and even the poorest, so extremely poor rural India. But they would love to find out more. Then I would also request you to make it multilingual. If there's a voiceover, like, in Botswana, I mean, even if I don't go there, if I can access that audio narrative, it would make such a difference. I know it takes time to make things multilingual, but that is fantastic if your museum could do it. And why are these displayed? Why are these objects even there? What is it that I get out of it? Like, what's in it for me as somebody who's living so far off? I'm sure some of the objects are from this part of the world. So why are they there? Why this particular, color or this shape? Or if we could connect it to something you see today. Like a lot of these craft and art traditions still exist in our part of the world, like the Indian subcontinent. So if one could then connect to somebody who still makes this blue pottery or makes that textile or this miniature painting tradition, so that would also help in giving a lot of respect and connecting those people in this part of the world. Because if you're sitting in Europe or America or Australia, you don't know that these are continuing traditions, right? It would help in generation of some business. Maybe there's going to be some financial connections that could be made. And these guys don't need to travel, right? These artisans can sit where they are, and maybe small clippings or videos where they describe how they did this. So it's very important for us today to know that we are a legacy of the past. We have history within us and we are a part of it. Because again, talking about my 18 to 24-year-old, that age group, they feel very disconnected. Their whole lives are spent focused on a mobile phone. And they are not able to feel, some of them can't even talk to their classmates because they don't know how to talk to them. Like it's very tough for us, to find out these connections. So maybe some ideas to educators across the world to develop projects around, classroom projects around these. exhibits. Okay, so there's that beautiful door. I guess it's a wooden carved door that's up against the wall. If there are similar objects anywhere in the world, maybe on a building or maybe in a museum, that would really be helpful and very exciting. And if you would like me or people I know around here to help you with that, we'd be really happy to do that.
Thank you so much for the
Thank you.
thought and for the offer. I
Thank you so much.
love to continue that conversation for sure. And I think what you've said about helping audiences and in particular young people actually connect to these things and sort of put in perspective why we care about them. I think that's really important. We tend to emphasize the skill or the artist or the patron for whom something was made for, but also thinking about why we care about these things, I think is a really important piece of that. As for you, Montsho, do you have any kind of recommendations yourself for some basic features we could think about in our new galleries?
Yeah, but first and foremost, let me say it'll be very important maybe for the Aga Khan Museum to consider collaborating or inquiring from different organizations and associations of people living with disabilities in Canada. For instance, I know we have the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, to find out from them exactly what type of accessibility features would they prefer to have installed in the gallery. There is this popular disability slogan, there is nothing for us without us. Secondly, I will recommend that the museum should consider having an audio guide, and there are some practical things like, the display cases height should be at a level that is accessible for people of small stature or wheelchair users, and there should be an alternative format, braille or large print for people with low vision, and lighting as well should be appropriate to enable visibility for people with low vision or people who are visually impaired, and color construct as well, so that the objects are visible. For sure, there should be ramps and elevators just to facilitate mobility for people in wheelchairs. And I'll finally say it'll be very important when everything is all said and done for the museum, the Aga Khan Museum, to consider maybe training these tour guides on how to best help, how to best guide people living with different types of disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you both for those thoughtful suggestions. I think what you're saying in both cases, from different points of view, though, that there are actually quite a few easy things to implement. And at the same time that we have a lot of resources to consult out there as we work through this, not to just be working within our own circle, our own bubble, that right here in Toronto, there are different groups we can connect with, or Poulomi, or offer from all the way from India. I think it'll be important for us to keep speaking to lots of different people as we think through these gallery plans. And thank you both so much for this conversation today. It's been give me a lot to think about, and I certainly hope to continue having these types of talks in the future. As I said, I have a lot to learn myself, but thank you for joining me today.